Hey guys, tonight we begin with the strange and overwhelming world of Constantinople at its absolute height, where daily life was so dense, so layered, and so thoroughly unlike anything you have been told to expect that just walking to the market will take more out of you than you currently have available. Then we follow Theodora, the woman who went from the circus floor to the throne of the most powerful empire in the medieval world, and who turned out to be considerably more dangerous than anyone who helped put her there had anticipated. After that, we find out what it was actually like to be a Byzantine scribe, a person whose entire job was to copy the knowledge of the ancient world by hand, in a room with inadequate heating, under the supervision of someone who had very personal feelings about the spacing of letters. And finally, we pull back the curtain on Byzantine monastic life, the official image of which involves silence, prayer, and spiritual perfection, and the actual reality of which involves inherited wealth, institutional politics, and at least one documented dispute over property that outlasted several emperors and most people's patience. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in Constantinople and the city does not wait for you to be ready. The noise reaches you before anything else does, not the gentle ambient hum of a city slowly coming to life, but the full, immediate, unapologetic pressure of a place that has been awake for several hours and is genuinely puzzled by your delay. Vendors calling out prices in Greek that moves too fast for your ear to follow, the syllables blurring together into a continuous cascade of commerce. The clatter of cartwheels over uneven stone, rhythmic in the way that something grinding against itself becomes rhythmic over time. The low, persistent ringing of bells from a nearby church that has already completed 2 full rounds of morning prayer while you are still in the process of remembering where exactly you are. You are somewhere in the middle city, not in the wealthy neighbourhoods that cluster near the Messe, the great central avenue that runs through the heart of Constantinople, from the Golden Gate in the west to the Augustan in the east, and not in the crowded outer districts pressed against the great walls where the smell is a permanent atmospheric feature of daily life. You are somewhere in between, which is the kind of geographic information that sounds helpful and turns out to be almost completely inadequate for navigating what comes next. Your room is small. The walls are close and slightly damp in the way that walls in port cities tend to be, as if the sea has been making a long, slow argument about ownership, and the building has been steadily and quietly losing. The floor is stone, cold enough to register immediately through the soles of your feet the moment you stand on it, and you stand carefully, because the space between your sleeping mat and the door is approximately the width of one deliberate step and one improvised one. The ceiling has a low beam that you have already memorized the location of, in the specific and educational way that you memorize things after your head has found them twice. You've been told that Constantinople is the center of the world. You have been told about its walls, which are the most formidable defensive structure anywhere in the known world, and which every person who has ever considered attacking the city has eventually confirmed by experience. You have been told about its churches, its markets, its extraordinary accumulated wealth, its position at the juncture of the trade routes that connected Europe to Asia and the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. You were not told about the smell, which needs to be addressed before anything else, because it arrives the moment you open the door and it does not subsequently leave. The city smells of people and animals and wood smoke and fish and the particular sharp chemical scent of dye from the textile workshops that operate in this quarter of the city, working through the night and through the morning and through as much of the day as there is daylight to work by. It smells of bread baking somewhere close enough to be a small daily cruelty when you cannot immediately locate the source. It smells of the animal waste that the streets manage with varying degrees of success depending on the hour and the weather and the individual decisions of everyone who has passed through since the last time anyone paid attention. And beneath all of that, something older and harder to identify directly, the accumulated presence of 500,000 human beings living in very close contact with one another in a relatively small area over the course of several hundred years. It is not entirely unpleasant, it is entirely inescapable. You will stop noticing it, you're told, after a few weeks. this information is apparently meant to function as reassurance. You step outside and the street immediately demonstrates that it was not designed with any one person's freedom of movement in mind. It was designed, if designed is even the right word for what appears to have happened organically over 4 centuries of dense urban growth, as a kind of collective ongoing negotiation, a continuous argument conducted at varying speeds and volumes between pedestrians and donkeys and small carts loaded with things that extend past their edges at inconvenient angles, and the occasional religious procession that treats every other use of the road as an interruption of something considerably more important. You are now a participant in this argument, whether you agree to enter it or not. The argument does not pause to orient you. It simply continues at full volume and expects you to find your position within it. The first thing you need is food, which seems like a manageable problem and turns out not to be. Street food in Byzantine Constantinople is abundant in a way that should be reassuring, and is instead slightly overwhelming, because every option requires a decision, and making a decision requires understanding what you're looking at, and understanding what you are looking at requires a level of familiarity with 10th century Constantinopolitan street cuisine that you do not currently possess. There are flatbreads of several varieties, some plain, and some dressed with oil and something dried and aromatic that you cannot immediately name. There is something being grilled over a small brazier that could be lamb, or could be something in the same general family as lamb, and the vendor is explaining this to you in a rapid Greek with the patient confidence of someone who assumes you understand every word and is only beginning to suspect otherwise around the 4th sentence, at which point his expression shifts slightly into the particular register of polite recalibration. You point at the thing on the brazier, he nods. You receive food wrapped in cloth, warm enough to matter on a morning that has not yet warmed. You eat it while walking because standing still in this street is not an option the street recognizes as valid. It is good, actually. Genuinely good. In the way that food always seems better when your body needed it more than usual, when you're operating on limited sleep in unfamiliar conditions, and the simple fact of something warm and caloric in your hands has already begun its work before you have properly tasted it. The spicing is unfamiliar, heavier on the cumin and the coriander than you're accustomed to, and there is something else underneath that you cannot quite identify and decide not to investigate too closely. But it is warm and it is filling, and for approximately 3 minutes you feel almost confident about the day ahead. Then you try to find the market, and the confidence evaporates in a specific and instructive way. Constantinople was built on a peninsula, and the city had grown into every available inch of that peninsula over the course of centuries, filling in the natural geography with streets that followed the logic of whoever had been there first, rather than any plan that would remain legible to someone arriving without a guide or a very good memory. The great forums, the public squares that the Romans had established, and the Byzantines had inherited and expanded and renamed and rebuilt in the image of their own civic theology, were theoretically landmarks you could navigate by. But reaching any of them from any given point in the middle city required navigating the intervening streets, which had a persistent habit of presenting themselves as direct routes, and then quietly revealing themselves to be something else entirely once you were committed to them and the more promising alternatives were behind you. You turn left because left seems correct. It is not correct. You turn right. That is also not correct in a somewhat different way that does not immediately help you understand what correct would look like in this context. You end up in a small courtyard that was clearly not expecting visitors and communicates this through the posture of the 2 men sitting against the far wall, who regard you with the expression of people who have watched this specific sequence of events unfold before, have formed a considered opinion of it, and have made a private collective decision not to intervene. You retrace your steps, which requires locating them first, which requires a period of standing in the middle of the courtyard, looking in several directions with the careful expression of someone conducting a confident geographic assessment, rather than the expression of someone who is lost, which are not quite the same expression, and the distinction appears to be legible, because one of the men against the wall says something brief to the other, and they both glance at you again with the specific quality of attention that indicates your performance has not been entirely convincing. The street you were on has somehow become 2 streets since you left it. This is a thing that happens in Constantinople, and it will keep happening, and understanding it as a feature rather than a malfunction is one of the adjustments that living here requires. The city is old enough and has been rebuilt and repaired and extended so many times through fires and earthquakes and the general attrition of centuries of dense urban habitation, that streets occasionally split and rejoin and run parallel to themselves for short distances before merging again, creating a navigational texture that makes complete internal sense to people who have lived here for years, and makes no sense at all to people who arrived recently and are still operating on assumptions about how streets behave that were formed somewhere considerably less complicated. Eventually, following the noise and the steadily increasing density of people moving in a purposeful direction, you find the market. The market is not one place. You had imagined a market as a concentrated location, a square or a coherent row of stalls. What you find instead is a system, a network of specialized districts that sprawls across several connected streets, each one dedicated to a specific category of goods and regulated by guilds whose rules cover not just what can be sold, but how it can be sold, at what hours, at what prices, at what margins, and by whom. The Byzantine state had strong and detailed opinions about commerce, and those opinions had been developing and hardening over centuries into a set of regulations that the vendors obeyed, negotiated with, and in some cases worked around with the refined creative energy of people who'd been doing so long enough to know exactly where the edges were and which ones had any give. The Book of the Eparth, the 10th century regulatory document governing Constantinople's commercial guilds, reads in parts like a legal text, and in parts like the record of someone who had personally witnessed every possible commercial violation, and was preemptively legislating against all of them simultaneously. It specified the correct physical locations for different types of traders within the city. It established permitted profit margins for various categories of goods, which had to be posted publicly so that buyers could verify them. It outlined the procedures for handling disputes between vendors and buyers, the obligations of guild members to one another, and to the city's administration, the penalties for a long list of specific infractions. The fact that such a document needed to exist at this level of detail tells you something very specific about the energy of the commercial life it was designed to regulate. You move through the separate districts. The Silk Quarter has its own particular atmosphere, a quality of controlled wealth that is different from the busier and louder sections of the market. Byzantine silk was one of the most valuable commercial commodities in the known world, particularly the purple, produced from the murex shellfish through a process that was labour-intensive and smell-intensive in roughly equal proportions, and worth both because the result was a colour and a depth that could not be replicated through any other method available in this era. The imperial court controlled silk production with the specific jealousy of an institution that understood what it was sitting on, and the regulations around who could wear which colours had the force and the apparent emotional investment of theological doctrine applied to fabric. The silk itself, when you find it and look at it properly in good light, is genuinely extraordinary in a way that makes the journey to this quarter worthwhile, even if you cannot afford anything in it. The colours are deep in a way that seems unlikely for cloth, as if the surface is only the beginning of what the dye has penetrated. You stand in front of a bolt of crimson that has purple running through it, at a depth that makes the colour difficult to describe simply, and you understand, standing here, why this was the thing that empires fought over, why merchants crossed impossible distances to acquire it, why the specific purple, called imperial purple, was restricted by law to the exclusive use of the emperor and his immediate family, why the phrase "born in the purple" meant something specific and something significant in this city. You cannot afford it. You knew this before you arrived. It is still mildly disappointing. The food market operates at a completely different register. Louder, faster, more physically immediate, organised by the kind of informal logic that develops when a large number of people, who all want to be in roughly the same place, are trying to do different things simultaneously. Fish from the Bosporus, some of them still moving in ways that establish very clearly that the transition from water to market was recent. Vegetables arranged in patterns that suggest someone thought about presentation, currently being rearranged by buyers who have their own ideas and the right to act on them. Cheeses of several kinds, wrapped and stacked and defended by vendors with the focused attention of people guarding something genuinely valuable, which in a city this size, dependent on supply chains that ran across unpredictable distances, they were. The spice trade that moved through Constantinople was one of the structural pillars of Byzantine commercial life, connecting the empire to the networks that extended east to Persia and India and Central Asia and south to Africa and the Arabian Peninsula, funneling through this single city the aromatics and seasonings and medicinal substances that the rest of Europe wanted badly enough to pay prices that still read as remarkable when you encounter them in context. The spice sellers occupy their own section of the market, and the air there is a concentrated version of the atmospheric complexity you noticed when you first stepped outside this morning, except here the individual components are separated enough to be distinguished. The sharp, clean heat of black pepper, which was worth its weight in silver in the markets of Western Europe, and was traded here in quantities that made it a unit of exchange rather than just a commodity. The warm sweetness of cinnamon, the slightly medicinal quality of clove, cardamom and nutmeg from sources so distant that most of the people selling them had no clear idea of where they originally came from, only of the network that delivered them. You stop here longer than you intended. It is not an unpleasant place to stop. You buy something modest, an olive from a clay jar that comes with a small piece of bread and an explanation of provenance that you follow approximately halfway through before losing the thread. You eat it anyway, standing to one side to let the current of the market continue past you. It is very good. Byzantine olive cultivation had centuries of refinement behind it, and that refinement is present in the oil in a way that registers clearly even on a palate currently adjusting to a general state of sensory overwhelm, bright and clean and precise in a way that is distinct from what you were accustomed to before arriving here. The crowd around you in the market is extraordinary in its variety, and this is one of the things that Constantinople does that no other city in this era manages quite as completely. This is a place where the known world comes to trade and to study and to argue theology, and to conduct diplomatic missions and to be converted or to attempt conversion, and in many cases simply to see with their own eyes whether the stories they have heard are accurate. You see people whose clothing suggests origins from every direction the trade routes run, whose languages create an ambient multilingual texture that is genuinely unlike anything you have encountered before in a single location. You hear Greek, the dominant language of the empire and the language of commerce and administration, but also Armenian, and something with the rhythmic character of a Slavic tongue, and the particular carrying quality of a negotiation being conducted in a shared commercial language by two parties who clearly find the process itself interesting, who are as engaged by the sport of the exchange as by its outcome. The Byzantines called this city the Queen of Cities, and the name was not modest. Standing here, in the noise and the smell and the colour and the continuous press of bodies from different cultures conducting different kinds of business simultaneously, you begin to understand why, not abstractly but physically, as a quality of the space you are occupying. There was nothing else like this. There had not been anything else like this since the height of Rome, and Rome was a memory now, maintained in the Byzantine identity as a claim and a standard rather than as a living reality. Constantinople was the living reality. This city, this density, this particular mixture of the magnificent and the overwhelming and the wet wall you're still slightly conscious of having touched, was what being the centre of the world actually felt like from the inside. The afternoon brings a different texture to the city, a shift in rhythm as the commercial energy of the morning gives way to something more social, more layered, and for you considerably more difficult to navigate. The Byzantines were, among many other things, deeply invested in public life in a way that expressed itself not just in commerce, but in the dense network of social relationships that structured daily existence and determined what was possible within it. Byzantine society was not anonymous. It was organised around who you were and who knew you and who knew you, around the slow and continuous accumulation of relationships that functioned as the actual infrastructure of daily life. Access to reliable merchants, to legal assistance, to the kind of information that allowed you to anticipate rather than simply react to events. All of it ran through personal networks that took years to build and required continuous maintenance once built. You're walking through this infrastructure without access to it, which is educational in a way that no briefing beforehand could fully prepare you for. The colonnaded walkways that ran along the Macy on both sides served as social space in a way that the street alone could not, providing shade and relative shelter, and the kind of semi-enclosed atmosphere in which conversations that were more than casual could be conducted without the full exposure of the open road. Under those columns, information moved. Not just commercial information, not just the prices of silk and spices, but the more significant categories of information about who was in favour at the palace and who was not, about which legal dispute was moving in which direction, about which administrator was receptive to which kind of approach. The Byzantines understood, with the sophisticated clarity of people who had been living in an imperial bureaucracy for centuries, the difference between formal power and informal influence, and the informal kind ran through exactly this kind of social space, through the continuous exchange of presents and courtesies and carefully calibrated small favours. You're outside of this, not unwelcome, not excluded with any particular intention, but outside of it in the way that anyone is outside of a network they have not yet built a place in. The conversations in the colonnades shift slightly as you pass, not hostilely but automatically, the way any private exchange adjusts to the presence of someone unfamiliar. You're not information, you're not connection, you are, in the social accounting of this city, a presence without context. The day moves toward late afternoon, and the light in Constantinople in the late afternoon has a quality that is genuinely worth stopping for. The city sits at the junction of two bodies of water, the Bosporus and the Golden Horn, and the light that comes off both of them in the hours before sunset has a particular clarity, a brightness that the stone of the buildings catches and holds differently from anything you have seen before. Hagia Sophia receives this light differently from everything around it, the lead of its great dome taking on a silver quality as the sun lowers, the silhouette of it against the western sky occupying the visual field, with the unassertive confidence of something that does not need to announce its scale because the scale announces itself. You have been inside once, you will go again before you leave. The interior of Hagia Sophia is among the things that cannot be adequately described to someone who has not experienced it, and the people who built it apparently understood this and planned for it. The dome, completed in 537 under Justinian, appears to float above the space it covers. The ring of windows at its base lets light in at an angle that changes through the day, turning the interior atmosphere from something cool and blue in the early morning to something gold and warm in the afternoon, and in that golden afternoon light the mosaics on the walls and the gold of the apse create an impression that is not architectural but theological, an impression that has been described for 15 centuries by people who entered expecting a building and received something closer to an argument about the nature of heaven, rendered in stone and light. The Byzantines built this building as a statement, and the statement has not lost any of its force in the 15 centuries since. You stand inside it and understand, in the way that you understand things that register in the body before the mind has finished processing them, exactly what they meant to say. You find your way back to your room by following the church bells, which turn out to be a more reliable navigation system than anything else you attempted during the day. Different churches ring at different intervals and with different tonal qualities, and the pattern of them, once you've been listening for enough days, creates an acoustic map of the surrounding neighbourhood that is considerably more useful in practice than the streets themselves. You file this away under knowledge earned the hard way, in the category with several other items that have been accumulating there. You sit on the sleeping mat. Your feet are presenting a detailed accounting of the day. Your back is in agreement with the feet. Your orientation has improved from genuinely lost to merely uncertain, which is genuine progress and deserves to be recognised as such. Your appetite is present, insistent, and already negotiating with your energy levels about whether it is worth going back out. You eat what you brought back from the market earlier, sitting in the failing light from the window, listening to the city continue outside without requiring your participation. Constantinople at the end of the day is not quieter than Constantinople at the beginning of it. It shifts in register, the commercial noise giving way to the residential noise of people finishing their day and beginning their evening, cooking and talking, and the continuous low-level sound of a dense neighbourhood conducting its own life. The city does not sleep exactly, it changes mode. You had imagined Constantinople as something grand and comprehensible, a place you could stand back from and understand whole, a city whose meaning was available to someone who arrived at it prepared. What you found was a city that refuses that distance. It pulls you into its immediate physical reality before you've had a chance to achieve perspective, and then it keeps moving at its own pace, and according to its own logic, and your job is simply to stay inside it and absorb what you can without losing your footing. There is something you will think about later, in a quieter place, when the immediate experience has had time to settle. The Byzantines who lived here were entirely certain that they would continue to live here, that the walls would hold, that the empire would continue, that Constantinople would remain what it had been. They were wrong, as it turned out, in the specific way that cities and empires are always eventually wrong about their own permanence. The end came in 1453, when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II breached the Great Theodosian Walls after a siege of 53 days, and the empire that had maintained its identity across 11 centuries finally did not. But standing here, in the 10th century at the height of what this place was capable of being, that ending is genuinely unimaginable. The walls are too thick, the commerce is too active, the gold is too bright in the afternoon, the bells are too certain. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. You close your eyes. The city is still audible outside your window, still in full operational mode, still arguing and praying and trading and navigating its own complex internal grammar without reference to your state of mind. It will be doing this in the morning. It was doing this before you arrived. The thought is not entirely comforting in the ordinary way of comforting thoughts, but it has its own stabilizing quality, the reassurance that comes from something much larger than you continuing to exist and function in ways that do not depend on your involvement. Constantinople does not need you to manage it tonight. Let it be whatever it is going to be without your supervision. You have done what you could with the day, and what you could with the day turned out to be more than you expected and less than you hoped for, which is approximately the correct calibration for arriving somewhere genuinely large for the first time. The sleeping mat is inadequate in several specific ways. You're too tired to care about most of them. Good enough is what you have tonight, and good enough is sufficient, and tomorrow the streets will make more sense, and the food will be more familiar, and the city will have given you one more day of the education that living inside it provides, whether you are ready for it or not. Several days pass. The city does not become simpler, but it becomes more familiar, which is a different thing and in its own way more useful. You begin to understand the food in a way that the first day did not allow. Byzantine Constantinople had a cuisine that drew on the full range of what the trade networks brought to the city, which meant the full range of the known world's aromatics and grains and preserved goods, and the specific combination of Greek culinary tradition and Near Eastern influence that had been developing in this city across several centuries, produced something that rewarded attention. The bread you buy at different stalls begins to differentiate itself in your perception, the variations of density and crust and the different additives, seeds, oil, honey, in some of the sweeter varieties, becoming legible in a way they were not when everything was simply unfamiliar. The fish preparations that seemed interchangeable on the first day reveal themselves as distinct, each reflecting different techniques and different origins. The wine is worth its own observation. Byzantine wine culture was sophisticated, built on centuries of Greek and Roman viticulture, and the wines available in Constantinople range from the rough and functional, the kind sold by street vendors in clay cups to people who needed to dilute the water, to the aged and resined varieties that appeared at the tables of those with resources and preferences. You try several, working your way through what is available at different price points, and discover that your palate, previously without strong opinions in this direction, is developing them at a rate that suggests the climate and the company are both contributing. The social customs around eating also become clearer over days. Byzantine meals at any level of society above the very poor were not simply refueling. They were occasions governed by customs about seating and order of service and the appropriate topics of conversation at different points in the meal that would have been invisible to you on the first day and become increasingly legible as you spend more time in the city and more time at tables where people are doing things according to conventions they take for granted. The washing of hands before eating, which happened publicly and with some formality, was not merely hygienic. It was a social signal, a performance of civilization, a small ceremony that placed the meal in its proper moral context before it began. The public water supply of Constantinople is one of the engineering achievements that the city does not advertise, but that makes everything else about it possible. The great cisterns beneath the city, some of them so large they were essentially underground lakes supported by hundreds of columns, held the water reserves that kept Constantinople functional through sieges and droughts. The aqueduct system that brought water from the hills beyond the city walls was Roman engineering, maintained and extended by the Byzantines. One of the pieces of infrastructure they had inherited and understood was essential to maintain. You visit one of the open cisterns that is accessible to the public one afternoon, standing at its edge and looking across the still water at the columns disappearing into the dim distance. and you feel the weight of the engineering below your feet in a way that is both literal and conceptual. The city works because of things like this, because of systems that are not visible from the street, but that are continuous with the street's capacity to function. The water carriers who moved through the streets delivering water to households that did not have direct access to the public supply were part of this system, the human element that completed the infrastructure where the engineering stopped. You begin to notice them after the first day or two, the particular way they moved with their loaded vessels, the specific calls they used to announce their presence in a street, the negotiation with householders that happened at doorways in a shorthand that you eventually begin to decode. They were lower in the social hierarchy than almost anyone else you encountered, but they knew the city's internal geography better than most, knew which household was likely to need water at what time, knew which streets were passable with a full load and which were not, had built over years of daily movement a mental map of Constantinople that was different from, and in some ways, more complete than any official description of the city. You think about this as you walk. How many different versions of the same city exist simultaneously, each built by a different kind of attention over a different set of years, each complete in its own terms and invisible from any of the others. The water carriers Constantinople and the merchants Constantinople, and the scholars Constantinople and the soldiers Constantinople, were all the same place, and all different places, overlapping in the physical space of streets and buildings while occupying entirely distinct social and experiential geographies. You are building your own version, slowly, inadequately, with too little time available to complete it. But even an incomplete version of Constantinople turns out to be more than you had before you arrived. You begin to learn the rhythms. The market districts open before you have fully woken up and reached their maximum intensity in the late morning, tapering through the early afternoon as the heat of the day discourages activity, and picking up again toward evening with a different character, less commercial and more social. The church bells divide the day into segments that the city uses as reference points, not just for prayer but for everything, for opening times and appointment keeping and the informal calendar of who should be where when. The population of the street changes through the day in patterns that are consistent enough to read. The labourers and vendors and servants moving with purpose in the early hours, the wealthier residents and their attendants appearing later, moving with the slightly different quality of people who have more options about how to spend the hour. The food sellers shifting their inventory through the day, selling what would not keep longest first. You learn to read the social signals. There is a way that people make room for each other in the street, and a way they do not, and the difference is partly about physical space and partly about social acknowledgement, about whether you are recognised as someone who belongs in the same space, or whether you're simply an obstacle to navigate around. You learn which posture says I belong here, and which says I am not sure where I am. The first one gets you through more doors than the second. You visit the Hippodrome, because you have heard about it for as long as you have been old enough to hear about anything connected to Constantinople, and because standing at the edge of the enormous oval track and looking at the crowds and the monuments and the obelisks and the bronze serpent column that has stood here since it was brought from Delphi by the first Constantine, you begin to understand something that the descriptions had not quite conveyed. The Hippodrome was not just an entertainment venue, it was the primary public space of the empire, the place where the emperor appeared before his people, and the people communicated their feelings about the emperor to his face, where factions organised and political tensions found expression, where the relationship between the ruler and the ruled was performed and sometimes renegotiated in ways that had real political consequences. You stand in it and feel the weight of all of that accumulated occasion pressing up through the stone. The chariot races themselves, when you see them, are extraordinary in a way that pure description cannot prepare you for. The speed of the horses in the confined oval is alarming. The noise of the crowd is physical, a pressure you feel in your chest before you process it as sound. The blues and the greens, the factions that organised much of the city's social life, and whose rivalry had at various points produced riots, political crises and constitutional consequences, are both present, and the quality of attention they bring to the event is different from the attention that modern crowds bring to modern sports. More invested, more politically charged, more directly connected to identities and loyalties that extend well beyond the track. You stand with the crowd for longer than you planned. It is impossible not to. The religious life of the city is impossible to avoid, and once you stop trying to avoid it, impossible not to find interesting. Constantinople was saturated with the sacred in a way that was structurally different from how the modern world organises the relationship between the religious and the secular. There was no clean separation. The church was inside the political structure at every level. Theological questions were political questions. The liturgical calendar shaped the working calendar. The icons on the walls of public buildings and private homes were not decoration in the sense we might understand decoration. They were presences, specific and named and addressed directly by people who understood themselves to be in a relationship with the figures depicted. You enter a small neighbourhood church one afternoon, not primarily from piety but from curiosity, and you stand in the back while the afternoon prayer office is conducted by a priest whose Greek is faster than anything you have yet heard, and whose familiarity with the text is so complete that the performance of it has taken on the quality of something between recitation and breathing, something the body does without requiring the full attention of the mind. The interior of the church is covered in images, gold and ochre, and the particular dark blue that Byzantine painters used for backgrounds, figures of Christ and the Virgin, and saints whose names you mostly know and some you do not, all of them rendered in the frontal, direct style that makes eye contact with you regardless of where you're standing in the room. The candles are burning, the incense is present in the air. The priest's voice continues, and something in the combination of all of these things, the accumulated sensory weight of the space, produces an effect that you had not anticipated, a quality of presence, a sense of being inside something that has been maintained continuously for a very long time by a very large number of people with a very consistent intention. You stay longer than you planned. This also turns out to be impossible not to do. The bathhouses are another kind of social institution that requires a paragraph of its own. Byzantine culture maintained the Roman practice of public bathing at a level of social importance that the subsequent Christian world would eventually find suspicious, and the great bathhouses of Constantinople served functions that were only partly about hygiene. They were where information moved, where social connections were maintained, where people of different status encountered one another on the specific terms that undress imposes, where the hierarchies of clothing and address were temporarily suspended. The conversations that happened in the bathhouses of Constantinople were real conversations, not the managed performances of official exchange. You learned things in the bathhouses that you could not learn anywhere else, and the people who understood the city best were the people who understood this and used it accordingly. You go once because you need to, and come out knowing 3 things you did not know before, none of them exactly what you were expecting to learn, and all of them immediately useful. Long before Theodora became the woman who saved an empire with a single speech, she was something considerably less admirable in the eyes of the society she would eventually rule. She was a performer. The daughter of a bearkeeper at the Hippodrome, raised at the edges of the entertainment world in 6th century Constantinople, trained from childhood in the physical and theatrical arts that delighted crowds and were regarded with considered social disapproval by the classes who watched those crowds from a careful distance. In the Byzantine Empire of the early 6th century, an actress occupied a very specific legal category. She was not simply a person of low social status in a general sense. She was, by the explicit provisions of Byzantine law, barred from marrying into the aristocracy. Her testimony in court carried reduced legal weight. She was, in the language of the legal codes, a person whose body and labour were considered public in ways that respectable women's were not, whose moral standing was assumed to be compromised by the nature of her profession, regardless of her individual conduct. Theodora knew exactly where she stood. The system had made the terms very clear, had been making them clear since she was old enough to understand that the world into which she had been born had already decided what she was, and she spent the first part of her life moving within those terms with a kind of fierce, practical intelligence that suggests she'd understood the rules completely and had already started thinking about how to get around them. She was, by the accounts of those who saw her perform, exceptional. Procopius, the court historian who would later write about her with a volatile and revealing combination of apparent grudging acknowledgement and barely controlled hostility in his secret history, described her performances in terms that made clear she was not simply talented but commanding, the kind of performer who generated a quality of attention in a crowd that was different from simple appreciation. She understood timing. She understood the continuous dynamic negotiation between performer and audience, what is given and what is withheld and when. and she worked that negotiation with a precision that was unmistakably and specifically hers. The Secret History of Procopius is a document that requires careful handling by anyone who wants to use it honestly. It was written as a deliberate counterweight to his official histories, intended to record what he claimed he could not publish, while the subjects of his account were still alive and in power. His treatment of Theodora is among the most vitriolic character assassinations in surviving ancient literature, detailed and specific and hostile in ways that have led historians to argue for centuries about where the historical record ends and the personal grievance begins. What is broadly agreed is that even the hostile account contains within it, at every point, an unmistakable acknowledgement of her power, her intelligence, and her capacity to operate in the most demanding political environment in the world with complete and consistent effectiveness. Procopius hated her with the specific intensity of someone who could not dismiss her, and that quality of hatred is itself a form of tribute that tells you something important. She survived things that would have destroyed someone without her particular combination of resilience, calculation, and the specific kind of intelligence that the stage develops. The ability to read what is actually happening in a room rather than what people want you to think is happening. She travelled, following work around the Eastern Mediterranean, spending time in Alexandria and moving across North Africa, accumulating an experience of the wider empire that most women of any class in Constantinople never had access to. She was not travelling as a tourist or as a diplomat. She was working, which meant she was moving through the social and economic layers of those cities at the level where people are honest about the texture of things, where the official version and the actual version are visibly different from one another in ways that only become invisible when you have enough distance from the ground level. She met people from every layer of society in those years. She observed how power worked from angles that were not available inside the palace. She learned, in the way that people learn when their survival depends on being accurate about human behaviour, how to read a room, and how to read a person, and how to identify the gap between what someone said and what they actually wanted. This is a form of education that is not available in the official curriculum, that cannot be taught in the way that theological argument or rhetoric can be taught, and that turns out to be more useful in the environment of an imperial court than either of those things in most circumstances. When she returned to Constantinople, she settled into a quieter life, working wool in a small house near the palace district, practicing the contemplative religious life that she had become genuinely and seriously interested in during her travels. The Miaphysite theological tradition she had encountered, with its specific understanding of the nature of Christ and its position outside the official Chalcedonian orthodoxy that the imperial court maintained, had connected with something real in her, and she maintained those connections into her settled life and beyond. Somewhere in this period, through channels that the sources do not clearly specify, she came to the attention of Justinian. Justinian was the nephew of the Emperor Justin, the most powerful man in the empire after one person, and soon to be the most powerful man entirely. He was intelligent and politically sophisticated and relentlessly ambitious, and apparently, from the moment he encountered Theodora, immediately and comprehensively fascinated by her in a way that no one around him understood, and most of them found alarming at a level they could not entirely articulate. She was not the kind of woman a man in his position was supposed to want. She was categorically not the kind of woman that Byzantine law permitted him to marry. He changed the law. He convinced his uncle the emperor to amend the relevant statutes to permit reformed women of the entertainment professions to marry into the nobility, which is the kind of legislative action that makes the strength of the underlying feeling fairly legible without requiring any additional documentation. His aunt, the Empress Euphemia, opposed the match with such complete and consistent firmness that it simply did not happen while she was alive. She died, and within a time interval that suggests Justinian had been waiting with considerable patience, and perhaps some impatience. He and Theodora were married. The directness of that sequence communicates something clearly. She became Empress when Justinian was proclaimed Emperor in the year 527, and the court adjusted to her presence the way a body of water adjusts to something substantial dropped into it, with considerable initial disruption, and then a new equilibrium that was clearly and permanently different from anything that had been there before. The diplomatic protocols were revised, the physical arrangements of the palace were revised, the assumptions about where authority resided and how it moved were revised slowly, and with varying degrees of willingness on the part of those who had to revise them. She was not a decorative empress. This is the least interesting and most important fact to establish, the fact that everything else about her follows from. She was not a woman who appeared at the appropriate ceremonial moments and retired when the important conversations began. She was present at policy discussions. She maintained her own extensive correspondence with foreign rulers and with ecclesiastical authorities across the empire. She had specific political interests that she pursued with persistence and thoroughness, and in some cases against the explicit preferences of her husband, which is the detail that most clearly defines the unusual character of their arrangement in the context of what Byzantine imperial custom expected of an empress. Her primary political passion, beyond the general exercise of imperial power in which she was consistently involved, was theological. The 6th century was a period of profound and structurally consequential theological dispute within the Christian world, and the specific controversy that consumed her attention and energy was the conflict between the Chalcedonian position that the imperial court officially endorsed and the immersive position that she personally held and publicly advocated for. This was not a minor doctrinal disagreement about abstract metaphysical questions. The theological positions taken in this dispute defined communities, motivated violence, determined ecclesiastical appointments, and the loyalty of bishops and monks across wide regions, and shaped the political geography of the Eastern Mediterranean in ways that would echo through the following centuries with enormous practical consequences. Theodora protected Miaphysite clergy at her own court when official imperial policy was actively working against them. She maintained correspondence with Miaphysite leaders across the empire and beyond its borders when direct contact was discouraged by official policy. She functioned in this specific domain as a parallel court within the court, one with its own networks and its own theological commitments, and Justinian, who held the opposing Chalcedonian position with his own genuine conviction, allowed this parallel operation to continue. Whether this represented a sincere respect for her theological integrity, a sophisticated political strategy designed to keep both major theological factions feeling they had a point of access to imperial decision-making, or some combination of the two that cannot be cleanly separated, the sources do not permit a confident conclusion. The ambiguity itself is revealing. Their relationship defied the simple categories the era provided for it. The crisis came in January of the year 532, and it is the event by which Theodora is most often remembered, the moment that fixed her in the historical record with a clarity that all the administrative and political work of her reign might not have achieved on its own. The Nika riots began as a dispute at the Hippodrome between the two great chariot racing factions that had been structuring the social life of Constantinople for generations. The Blues and the Greens were not simply sports supporters in the modern sense. They organised neighbourhoods, maintained their own hierarchies, channelled political grievances, provided quasi-military capacity in certain circumstances, and served as vehicles for the expression of popular sentiment in a political culture that had few other legitimate channels for it. The government found them useful in some circumstances and found them terrifying in others, and by January of 532, the government had given them a reason to be unified against it, which was a category of situation the government was not well prepared for. Members of both factions had been arrested following an incident of public disorder, and the Hippodrome crowd, finding itself in the unusual position of agreement about something, began demanding their release. The demand escalated into riot. The riot became a rebellion. Buildings burned, significant portions of the city were destroyed, including much of the area around the palace complex and the original church of Hagia Sophia. A rival emperor, a man named Hypatius, was proclaimed in the Hippodrome by the insurgents. The palace was surrounded. The established government was, in the most direct practical sense, losing. Justinian, by the accounts that survived this moment, was preparing to flee. His closest advisors were calculating the same thing. Ships had been prepared at the harbour on the south side of the palace. The mood in the council chamber was the specific mood of people who have privately concluded that the situation is lost and are engaged in the final logistics of personal preservation while maintaining the external appearance of continued deliberation. Theodora spoke at this meeting. What she said has been preserved through Procopius, who included it even in his hostile account because he could not tell the story of the Nika riots accurately without it, which itself says something significant about the weight her words carried in that room and in the memory of everyone present. She said that she would not flee. She observed that she could not imagine, having worn the purple, living without it. She delivered a formulation about death and exile that has come down through 15 centuries with its force intact, that the imperial robe was a fine burial garment, that dying in the purple was preferable to living stripped of it. She said this not with the register of a prepared speech, not with the performing quality she had developed over years on the stage, but with the flat, immediate, undecorated certainty of someone who had already made the decision before entering the room and was simply reporting it as a fact. The room changed. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The room changed. The calculation that had been running in the minds of everyone present encountered an obstacle it had not anticipated, which was a person who was genuinely not afraid and was not performing equanimity. Justinian did not flee. He sent his generals Belisarius and Mundus with their troops into the hippodrome, and the rebellion was suppressed with the thoroughness of people who had been very frightened and were now very angry. Hypatius was captured and subsequently executed. The Nika rebellion, which had come within hours of ending the Justinianic dynasty and reshaping the political history of the Eastern Mediterranean, was over. What Theodora had done in the council chamber was not technically the thing that crushed the rebellion. Soldiers did that. What she had done was restore to the room the collective will to use the power that was available to it. The suppression was possible because Justinian stayed and acted. He stayed because she stayed, or at minimum because her refusal to flee made the flight option feel like something other than the only logical choice, made it feel like a choice with a cost that was legible and specific and that she had made clear she was not willing to pay. She lived for another 17 years after the Nika riots, continuing to function as what was in all practical terms a co-ruler, maintaining her own agenda, pursuing her theological commitments, applying imperial power on behalf of people who would otherwise have had no access to it. She founded a refuge called Metanoia, meaning repentance, on the Asian shore of the Bosporus, a home for women who had been working in prostitution and who had been, in many cases, sold into it as children, or placed into it by circumstances they had no real ability to resist. It was funded by the imperial treasury and by Theodora's own resources, and it housed several hundred women according to various accounts. It was not universally praised by contemporaries. Some found it coercive in its methods. The historical record on it is complicated, as the historical record on most institutions that address so complicated social realities tends to be. But it represented the direction of imperial power toward a population that every other structure in the city ignored or exploited, and it was maintained consistently over the years of her reign. She died in 548, most likely from cancer, at an age that was probably in the mid-40s. Her image survives in the apse mosaic at the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, commissioned during her lifetime by Justinian's representatives in the city. The mosaic shows her with the specific quality of frontal presence that Byzantine sacred art developed into a language of its own. The gaze direct and steady and entirely composed, the eyes holding the viewer with an attention that is not asking for anything in return. The figure holds the chalice that was her offering, the liturgical gift that was her participation in the ceremony depicted. She is dressed in imperial purple and gold and wears the crown of her office. She looks as though she has considered every possible assessment of her, and found none of them particularly alarming. Justinian survived her by 17 years. He never remarried. He continued the building projects she had begun, finished the ecclesiastical programs she had supported, and governed what became an increasingly strained empire with the specific quality of persistent, relentless application that had always characterized him. Whether he was the same without her is a question the sources approach obliquely rather than directly. What they suggest, without quite saying, is that something had been present when she was alive that was not present afterward. Something in the quality of decision-making or in the quality of engagement with difficult situations that was difficult to name and impossible to replace. She had been, among many other things, the person in the room who stayed when staying was hard and the leaving seemed logical. That is not a small thing. In the history of the Byzantine Empire, it turned out to be a very large thing indeed. To understand what Theodora had been before she was Empress, you need to understand what the entertainment world of 6th century Constantinople actually was, because it was not what any polite description of it suggests. The Hippodrome was the centre of popular culture in Constantinople in the way that nothing in the modern world quite maps onto. It was the largest structure in the city, seating somewhere between 30 and 100,000 people, depending on the account you trust, and on race days it was full. The races were the thing, yes, but the races were surrounded by a continuous culture of performance and spectacle that ran through the entertainers, the mimes, the acrobats, the musicians, the performers who worked the crowds before and after and between the main events. These were the people who occupied the social world that Theodora grew up in, and it was a world with its own hierarchies, its own codes, its own demands on the people who lived inside it. To be a performer in this world was to be permanently and professionally exposed. Your body was your instrument and your product. Your ability to read a crowd and adjust was your skill and your livelihood. Your survival depended on your ability to attract attention and hold it, night after night, in front of audiences that could and would find someone else if you lost them. This is not a comfortable life. It is, in certain important respects, an excellent education in human nature. The specific training that mime performers received was physical and social simultaneously. They learned to use their bodies with precision, to control expression and movement and timing in ways that most people never develop. They learned the material that made audiences laugh, which required understanding what audiences found funny and why, which is a more sophisticated analytical task than it might appear. They learned how to calibrate energy, how to build and release tension in a crowd, how to manage the relationship between themselves and the mass of people they were performing for. These skills. What the entertainment world also provided was an unfiltered view of the social order it served. Performers occupied the bottom of the official hierarchy while being in continuous close contact with people from every level of it. They saw the wealthy in conditions that the wealthy did not necessarily intend to be seen in. They heard things that official interactions were designed to conceal. They understood the gap between the public presentation and the private reality of Byzantine aristocratic life in a way that only people who served that life from the bottom could understand. Theodora took all of this with her when she left. The intelligence she brought to the imperial court was not the intelligence of someone who had been educated in the theoretical disciplines, though she was clearly capable of engaging with those disciplines when the situation required it. It was the intelligence of someone who had been learning about human beings in conditions that required accuracy, that corrected errors immediately and concretely rather than theoretically. The Empress, who maintained her theological commitments against the opposition of the full apparatus of imperial religious policy, was the same person who had learned, in the entertainment world of the Hippodrome, that knowing what you actually believe and being willing to say it clearly is the only reliable strategy when the performance stops working. Her years of travel around the Eastern Mediterranean between her first and second periods in Constantinople are important and under-examined. She was in Antioch, she was in Alexandria. She spent time in North Africa, in the province of Pentapolis, apparently in the household of a Roman official there. In Alexandria, she would have encountered the Miaphysite theological community in a form quite different from the embattled minority it was in Constantinople. In Alexandria, the Miaphysite position was not a theological deviation held by a protected group in the Empress's private apartments. It was the theology of the majority, of the Coptic Church, of an ancient and self-confident community that understood its own tradition clearly and was accustomed to defending it. What she learned in Alexandria is not documented directly. What is suggestive is the quality of her subsequent theological commitment, which was not the enthusiastic engagement with a new idea, but the settled conviction of someone who had thought the question through carefully and arrived at a position they were not going to be argued out of. That quality of settled conviction does not develop from exposure to an idea in passing. It develops from sustained engagement with a community that holds the idea as its central truth. The figure of Timothy of Alexandria, the Miaphysite patriarch who was in Alexandria during the period Theodora may have been there, is sometimes mentioned in connection with her theological formation. Timothy was a scholar and an administrator, and a defender of his community's theological independence against the pressure of the imperial church, and the combination of intellectual seriousness and political pragmatism that characterized his leadership of the Alexandrian church is recognizable as something Theodora would have found interesting and instructive. Whether the connection was direct or only through the general atmosphere of the community, the effect on her is traceable in what she did with the authority she later held. There is a final element of Theodora's story that tends to get overshadowed by the more dramatic moments, and it deserves its own attention before we move on. In the years after the Nika riots, after the crisis had been resolved and the power was secure, and the rebuilding of the parts of the city that had burned was underway, Theodora governed. Not in the ceremonial sense of appearing in the correct places at the correct times, not in the limited sense of exercising influence through proximity to the actual decision-maker. She governed, making decisions that had real consequences for real people, applying the tools of imperial authority with the specific intentionality of someone who had spent her whole life thinking about what those tools were for and how they should be used. The legal changes she initiated or supported during Justinian's reign represent a body of reform that reflects a consistent set of priorities: the protection of women in circumstances where the existing law left them exposed, the limitation of practices that allowed the exploitation of people who had no practical recourse against it, the extension of legal recognition to situations that the older law refused to see, the reform of the laws governing divorce, which had previously allowed men to dissolve marriages for reasons that had no reciprocal application to women, showed a particular understanding of where the asymmetry in the legal system produced results that were difficult to defend on any grounds other than custom. The changes were not revolutionary by the standards of what a genuine commitment to legal equality would require. They were not intended to be revolutionary. They were the kind of change that is possible within a conservative system, when someone with authority and specific knowledge of what the system is failing to do decides to push it in a particular direction, with consistent pressure over time. The handling of the Miaphysid controversy over the long years of her reign demonstrates a different quality of governance, one that operated through patience and indirect pressure rather than direct decree. Justinian could not simply reverse his own official theological position, which was politically supported by the Western Church and by significant parts of the Eastern Church hierarchy, without creating an institutional crisis that would cost more than it resolved. Theodora did not ask him to. She instead created within the palace itself a space where Miaphysite clergy could live and work and maintain their practice under imperial protection, outside the reach of the enforcement machinery that was nominally pursuing imperial religious policy. This was not subtle exactly, in the sense that the people who needed to know about it knew about it. It was subtle in the sense that it operated in a space that the official policy had not explicitly addressed, maintaining a productive ambiguity that served the interests of both parties better than a direct confrontation would have. There are people still alive in the Eastern Mediterranean today who trace the survival of their religious community, its texts and its practices and its institutional continuity, to decisions made in the middle of the 6th century by a woman who had grown up on the margins of the entertainment world in Constantinople. That is the scale of what individual decisions can accomplish when the person making them is in the right position at the right moment and understands clearly what is actually at stake. Theodora understood. She usually did. The mosaic at Ravenna shows her at the moment of her maximum power and influence, at the height of what she had made of herself. The figure is composed, formal, gold-draped, every element of the image calculated to communicate imperial authority and sacred status simultaneously. But if you look at the face with the attention it rewards, there is something in the expression that is not entirely absorbed by the official statement. The eyes have the quality of someone who has seen a great deal and has not been surprised by most of it, and who is looking at you with the specific interest of someone who is still, after everything, curious about what happens next. That quality of attention, the refusal to stop paying attention even when paying attention had cost her everything it could cost, is what made her who she was. The performance career developed it. The years of travel confirmed it. The long study of power from the outside crystallized it into something she could use. And the years of wielding power from the inside proved that it was not diminished by the position, but sharpened by it. The specific quality of Justinian and Theodora's partnership is worth spending a moment with, because it does not fit the categories the era provided for it, and it does not fit the categories we tend to reach for when we describe powerful couples in history. They were not equals in the formal sense. Byzantine law and Byzantine custom did not recognize a category of equal imperial partnership. There was an emperor and there was an empress, and the difference between those two offices was not simply nominal. The emperor was the source of legitimate authority. The empress participated in that authority through her relationship to him, through her management of the spaces and functions that the structure of the palace assigned to her, through the specific dignities and protocols attached to her office. What Theodora and Justinian had was not formal equality. It was something more unusual, a genuine working partnership in which the two people involved had different strengths and different connections and different perspectives, and used them in coordination in ways that made both of them more effective than either would have been alone. Justinian was brilliant at the kind of thinking that moved from principle to application, at the construction of legal and administrative frameworks that systematized what had previously been ad hoc, at the relentless pursuit of the large coherent project across the decades it took to realize. He was less naturally equipped for the kind of intelligence that reads individual situations and individuals accurately in real time, that knows when a person is giving you their real position, and when they are performing one, that understands what the room actually contains as opposed to what it is supposed to contain. Theodora was very good at that. The life she had led before the palace had made her good at it in ways that no palace education could have produced. And Justinian, who was intelligent in a way that included knowing what he was not best at, appears to have recognized this and to have valued it. The Justinianic legal reforms, the corpus juris civilis that reorganized and codified Roman law, and that became the foundation of the legal systems of most of Europe and its successor states, were Justinian's project in a fundamental sense. But the specific provisions within those reforms that addressed the conditions of women, the legal status of children born outside formal marriage, the protections available to women against exploitation, these provisions show the marks of someone who understood the relevant conditions from the inside and who had the specific kind of interest in getting them right that comes from personal rather than theoretical knowledge of the problem. The corpus juris civilis is still in use, in various modified forms, in the legal systems of countries across Europe, Latin America, and beyond. Its provisions about marriage and inheritance and personal status have shaped the legal conditions of hundreds of millions of people across 15 centuries. Some of those provisions were better than they would have been without Theodora. How many and which ones cannot be established with confidence from the surviving record. What can be established is that someone with her particular history and her particular access was in the room when the decisions were made, and that she was not a person who left rooms without effect. The Western portraits of her, the mosaic at Ravenna being the most famous, were commissioned by Justinian's representatives in Italy as part of a political and theological statement about the nature of the imperial couple's authority and the legitimacy of their governance over the reconquered Western territories. Theodora had died by the time the church of San Vitale was dedicated in the year 548, though the mosaics may have been in preparation before her death. Her image faces Justinian's across the apse, the two figures flanking the altar in the positions usually occupied in Byzantine church programs by figures of sacred significance. They are not, in the strict theological sense, worshipped, but they are placed where they are placed with deliberate intention, in a space designed to communicate the presence of sacred authority, and the statement being made by their placement is one that the tradition of imperial imagery in the Byzantine world had been developing the vocabulary for across centuries. She deserved a portrait that communicated the scale of what she was. The Ravenna mosaic gives her one. The gaze holds, the gold holds, the composure holds. Everything around her in the image is designed to communicate power and sanctity. She looks as though she already knew that. That is the difference between influence and transformation. Most people who hold power use it to continue the existing arrangements in their own favour. A small number use it to change the arrangements themselves, to push the system towards something it was not before they arrived. Theodora was one of the second kind. The empire she helped rule was different from the one she entered, and it was different in direction she had chosen. The room you work in as a Byzantine scribe is not the room you had imagined. Before you arrived, you had constructed a mental image of the ideal scriptorium, tall windows admitting clean morning light onto well-organised desks, the calm and orderly atmosphere of a space designed around the requirements of careful and important work. The reality is a room that is technically indoors but conducting an ongoing seasonal negotiation through its walls with whatever is happening outside them. The light comes through two windows that face the wrong direction for most of the useful working hours of the day. The desk is built to the exact height of the monk who built it some years ago, and that person was a different shape from you, in ways that become progressively more apparent as the morning advances. You adjust. You have been adjusting since your first day here. The scriptorium is attached to a monastery within the city, one of the several hundred religious institutions that filled Constantinople and its immediate surroundings in the Middle Byzantine period, and the work done here is considered holy in a way that frames your physical discomfort as an experience you're supposed to receive as spiritually productive rather than simply unpleasant. The books you're copying are precious beyond their material value. Some of them are the only surviving copies of texts that were composed 1,000 years before you were born. Texts whose ideas shaped the world that shaped the empire that shaped this room. Texts that have been carried through wars and natural disasters and the general attrition of time by a succession of hands that added their own careful contribution to the chain of transmission. Your job is to add yours, carefully, accurately, letter by letter, without introducing errors, without taking shortcuts, without allowing the progressive stiffness in your writing hand to convince you that a slightly different letter form is close enough to the correct one to pass without comment. It is never close enough. This is the most consistent thing you have learned here. Your supervisor is a monk whose age is difficult to determine and whose opinions are not. He has been running this scriptorium for long enough that his opinions have passed through the stage of being preferences and the stage of being convictions, and have arrived at the stage of simply being facts, and the facts include specific views on the correct angle of pen to parchment, the appropriate pressure required to achieve a stroke of consistent weight throughout its length, the spacing between letters within words and between words within lines, the handling of the abbreviations that the scribal tradition had developed over centuries to compress frequently used words and phrases, and the theological implications of careless ligature, which is a category of criticism that sounds abstract until he demonstrates it with a specific example from a specific manuscript, at which point it ceases to be abstract. You've been working under his supervision for 3 weeks, and have been corrected more times than you have completed a page without interruption. The corrections are not unkind, they are simply continuous, which has a cumulative effect that is distinct from being unkind but is not entirely comfortable. Byzantine scribal culture had developed over centuries a sophisticated and detailed set of standards for manuscript production, and those standards were upheld with a seriousness that reflected the seriousness with which the Byzantines regarded texts in general. This was a civilization that understood itself as the direct and legitimate inheritor of the full weight of Greek and Roman literary culture, and that self-understanding was not abstract or ceremonial. It showed up as institutional commitment in the copying programs that monasteries and aristocratic libraries maintained, in the practices of annotation and commentary that treated ancient texts as living things in continuous conversation with the present rather than as historical artifacts to be preserved passively. The manuscripts were working documents. Keeping them accurate and complete and in circulation was a form of civic and religious duty simultaneously. The parchment you work on is expensive in ways that are visible in every aspect of how you're expected to handle it. Made from goat skin through a process that took weeks and involved multiple stages of soaking and scraping and stretching over a wooden frame and drying in tension and cutting, the sheets have a specific quality that you have learned to read with your fingertips. The flesh side is smoother and accepts the pen more consistently. The hair side retains a subtle texture that makes fine work harder. The edge of the sheet will tear if you're not careful with it, and tears are difficult to repair in ways that are aesthetically acceptable and impossible to repair in ways that are invisible. When you ruin a sheet with an error serious enough that it cannot be scraped out and corrected, you feel the expense of the ruined material in a specific and immediate way, in the form of your supervisor's expression. His expression is expressive. The ink is iron gall, mixed fresh each morning in small batches from a recipe that exists entirely in your supervisor's hands rather than on any written document. The ratios and timing arrived at through decades of making until the correct process is as automatic as breathing. It starts pale when you first lay it down, a brownish tone that can seem alarming to someone who expects finished work to be black. It darkens as it oxidizes over the following hours and days, deepening to the rich, dense black that the finished manuscript requires. You have been told this enough times that you know it intellectually. You still feel a mild unease at the colour of the freshest lines on a page, a sense that the work looks incomplete, even when you know that the incompleteness is in your expectation rather than in the work. The quill is cut fresh frequently, because the point wears during use, and a worn point produces lines that lack the consistency the standards require. Cutting a new point is its own practice, a small skill that took you longer to develop than you expected, and that your supervisor watched you learn with the patient expression of someone witnessing a predictable process proceed at its expected pace. You learn the text before you write it. This is the established practice, reading through the section you're about to copy with enough attention to understand the content before the writing begins, so that the writing can proceed with some fluency rather than treating each word as a problem to be solved individually. Byzantine scribes were not transcriptionists in the purely mechanical sense. They were, in most cases, educated people who understood the content they were copying, and that understanding was expected to show in the quality of the work. A scribe who copied without understanding made a specific kind of error, errors of sense and context that were detectable on inspection, and that reflected on the institution as well as on the individual. The text, if you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The text you are currently engaged with is a detailed theological commentary on a passage from one of the Cappadocian Fathers, dense with argument and with the specific vocabulary that Byzantine theological writing had developed over centuries into a highly precise technical instrument. It is not, you occasionally notice during the slower sections of the morning, the most engaging material when your body is still in the early stages of warming up, and your hand is cold and the light is coming from the wrong direction. But the importance of the work is real, and you know it is real, and that knowledge provides a kind of counterweight that keeps you at the desk when nothing else quite would. The other scribes in the room work with a quality of focused quiet that you're in the process of developing. Some of them have been doing this for years, and their hands move with a rhythm that is close to meditative, laying down line after line with a consistency that seems almost impossible until you have watched it long enough to understand how it works. The conscious attention is given to the text, to the meaning being reproduced, while the physical process of letter formation has been internalized deeply enough that it runs without requiring the same active management. The hand knows what to do, the mind stays with the content. They work together without competing for resources. You are not there yet. You're in the phase where the hand and the mind are in continuous active negotiation, and the negotiation is expensive. The midday break comes at the bell and you eat with the community in the refectory in the enforced silence that the rule prescribes during meals. A reader performs the appointed text from a small elevated platform, and the reading has the quality of delivery that comes from someone who has been reading in this room for a long time. A practiced solemnity that knows where the pauses belong and places them with the confidence of someone who has developed a settled relationship with the texts. The food is simple and consistent, bread and oil and dried legumes prepared in ways that are adequate and unvarying. The diet of people who need their bodies to function over long periods and are not particularly interested in the experience of eating. You eat it without complaint, partly because complaint is not in the grammar of this space, and partly because you are genuinely hungry. After the break, you return to the page. The afternoon light improves for a period, when the sun reaches the angle that allows it to come through the windows directly rather than diffusely, and in that period something changes in the quality of the work. The letters feel more consistent. The spacing settles into something you're not actively unsatisfied with. You complete 3 pages without intervention from your supervisor, and when he passes behind you during the 3rd page, he makes a sound that is not quite approval, but is clearly distinguishable from correction, which in the grammar of this space functions as high praise. Then the light shifts again, and you move a small lamp to compensate, and the lamp throws shadows in the directions that are least helpful, and you adjust again. There are aspects of this work that only reveal themselves after weeks of doing it, aspects that are not visible from the outside or in the early days of practice. The physical rhythm of the writing, once you have pushed past the initial awkwardness and the ongoing education from your supervisor, has a quality that is genuinely difficult to name and consistently attractive. The hand moves through familiar shapes while the mind maintains its attention to the text, and the relationship between the two activities is not one of competition but of mutual support, each one freeing the other to do what it does best. The Byzantine contemplative tradition had specific terms and specific interest in this kind of integrated attention, the gathering of the dispersed parts of the self into a single focused presence that was neither purely physical nor purely intellectual, but continuously both. The scriptorium was understood as one of the environments in which this could be cultivated, which is why it was treated as holy work and not merely as technical work. You begin to understand, over days and then weeks, why people spent their entire working lives in rooms like this one. Not because they were required to, though some of them were, because the work itself had a quality of meaning that accumulated rather than depleting, that grew with practice rather than becoming routine in the diminishing sense of that word. You also begin to understand the specific weight of what you are participating in. The text in front of you was composed in the 9th century as a response to a text from the 3rd century, which was itself in conversation with texts from the 1st century, which were in conversation with the texts of ancient Greece and the ancient Near East. You are one link in a chain of human attention that stretches further than is entirely comfortable to contemplate directly. Each link a person sitting at a desk with inadequate light and an aching hand, adding their particular care to the passage of something that was not theirs, but that they were temporarily responsible for. The chain goes forward as well. The copy you are producing will itself eventually be copied, in a room you cannot imagine, by a hand you will never know, in a time that has not yet arrived. They will not know your name. They will see the work of your hands. The letters you are laying down today will be the evidence of your attention, the record of what you brought to this task in this room on this day. That is a different kind of permanence from most of what a life produces. You lay down the last lines of the day's work at the hour when the bell calls the community to evening prayer. You clean the pen and cap the ink and place the manuscript as it should be placed. The text is slightly more present in the world than it was this morning. By some small fraction, the thing you were asked to help preserve has been preserved for another day, another generation, another link in the chain. It is not a large contribution. It is not a small one either. There are other things about the scribal life in Byzantine Constantinople that become clear slowly, through the accumulation of days rather than through any single moment of revelation. The copying was not the only work. The reading that preceded it was work. The checking that followed it was work. There was a practice called collation, comparing the copy you had made against the original to verify accuracy, line by line, which had the particular quality of attention that combining intense concentration with the possibility of discovering your own mistakes produces. Some errors were caught this way, corrected in the margins with small marks that indicated what the correct reading should be and what had been written instead. Others were caught later, by your supervisor, or by the next reader, or in some cases not until centuries had passed, and scholars working in a different era with different tools examined the manuscript and noted the place where the chain of transmission had introduced something that did not belong. You think about this possibility sometimes. The idea that an error you introduce today might persist in the text for generations, might be copied by the next person, and the person after them might find its way into a printed edition produced centuries after you're gone, might become the standard reading of a passage in a language that has not yet been developed by people who have not yet been born. The weight of that possibility is real, and it operates as a kind of pressure on the hand, a reason to pause and check again before committing a word to parchment. Your supervisor has a story he tells, briefly and only once, about a text that had been copied incorrectly at some point in its transmission. A single word changed to another word that was similar in form but different in meaning, and how this error had changed the sense of a crucial passage in a theological argument, and how that changed sense had been cited in a subsequent theological controversy as evidence for a position that the original author had not held, and how the controversy had generated considerable heat before someone examined an older manuscript and found the correct reading. He tells this story without drama, as a statement of fact rather than as a cautionary tale, and then he returns to whatever correction he was about to make. But the story stays with you, the single word, the generation of misreading that followed from it, the eventual correction. This is not a comfortable thing to think about while you're laying down line after line with imperfect hands in imperfect light, and yet it is part of the work, part of what the work requires you to understand about itself. You're not just making marks on parchment. You are maintaining the accuracy of a transmission that is larger than you and longer than your working life, and the accuracy matters not because it will be checked immediately by a supervisor, though it will be, but because it will be used by people you will never meet who will trust it in ways that you will never witness. You take more care after your supervisor tells that story, not because you were careless before, but because care has additional meaning now. The manuscripts you copy are not all equally engaging. Some of the theological texts are dense in ways that require your full attention to follow even at reading speed, and maintaining that level of attention while simultaneously managing the physical production of accurate letters is work in the most complete sense, demanding on the mind and the body simultaneously. Other texts are narratives, chronicles of events and lives, and these move with a momentum that makes the copying easier in some ways, the sense of the passage carrying you forward so that the hand follows rather than leads. There is one manuscript you work on for several days that is a medical text, a collection of treatments and diagnoses assembled from earlier sources, and copying it produces a strange effect of being simultaneously inside a practical manual and inside a record of everything human bodies have suffered and been subjected to in the search for relief. The treatments described range from things that still make sense in terms of modern understanding to things that are clearly based on frameworks that have no connection to how the body actually works, but all of them are offered with the same quality of seriousness, the same assumption that this information is worth preserving because someone somewhere will need it and will benefit from having it accurately transmitted. You find yourself reading more carefully than you need to for the copying, following the arguments, wondering about the outcomes for the patients described, thinking about the hands that assembled this information originally and the hands that have copied it since. The chain of care contained in a medical text is different in character from the chain of care in a theological text, more immediately connected to specific suffering and specific attempts to relieve it, but the chain is the same kind of thing. There is an afternoon, late in your time in the scriptorium, when the light comes right and the text is moving well, and your hand has finally internalized enough of the rhythm that it is no longer requiring your conscious management. And in that state, something happens that your supervisor later identifies, without using this word as the thing the work is for. The copying and the understanding are not separate activities anymore. They are not two processes running in parallel, each taking something away from the other. They are one process, the text moving through your comprehension, and your hand simultaneously, the meaning and the making happening together in a way that feels, for a period whose duration you cannot later accurately reconstruct, like something close to perfect attention. It does not last. Your hand cramps slightly and you adjust and the moment passes. But it was real, and you recognized it while it was happening, which is not something you can always say about the important moments of a life. Your supervisor sees your expression when you set down the pen, and the sound he makes is the same as the sound he made when you completed the 3 pages without correction. But it has a slightly different quality, a recognition rather than an evaluation. You do not need him to explain it, you already know. The days in the scriptorium follow a rhythm that you eventually stop noticing as a rhythm and start experiencing simply as time. Morning prayer, the preparation of materials, the work itself, the midday break, the afternoon work, the evening prayer, the short period before sleep when reading was permitted and encouraged. The repetition does not become monotonous in the diminishing sense. It becomes structural, the way the bones of a building become structural, invisible but load-bearing. There are small communities within the larger community of the monastery. The scribes have their own culture, their own shared vocabulary about the work, their own hierarchy based on skill and experience that runs parallel to the monastic hierarchy based on seniority and office. You find your place in this smaller community slowly, through the accumulation of days in the same room with the same people doing the same work, through the specific kind of trust that develops when people have observed each other's hands for long enough to know what is genuine and what is performance. The oldest scribe in the room has been doing this for more years than you have been alive, and his manuscripts are passed around when there is a question about how something should be done, used as reference points for everything from letter form to layout. He himself is quiet in a way that has passed through the stage of personality and arrived at the stage of condition, something the room is organised around rather than something produced by conscious effort. You sit near him when you can, not to ask questions, though he would answer them if you did, but because the quality of attention he brings to the work is present in the air around him, and it helps. You leave the scriptorium at the end of your time there with a manuscript completed and checked and placed in the library's keeping, and with the specific kind of tiredness that comes from work that used everything you had. The tiredness is not unpleasant. It is the tiredness of something finished, which is a different kind entirely from the tiredness of something unresolved, and the difference is significant enough to be worth noting. There are things about the scribal life in the Byzantine world that extend well beyond the scriptorium itself, and understanding them requires pulling back from the individual desk and looking at the larger system the desk was part of. Byzantine Constantinople was, among its many other identities, a city of books. This is not metaphor and not exaggeration. The concentration of libraries in the city, both monastic and private, was without parallel anywhere in the medieval world. The great families maintained collections, the monasteries maintained collections. The imperial palace maintained a library whose holdings, at their height, represented the most comprehensive assembly of Greek literary, scientific and philosophical texts in existence. The university that operated in Constantinople across different periods drew on these holdings and produced scholars who added to them through commentary and compilation and original work. The culture of the book in Byzantium was not passive. It was not simply a matter of accumulating old texts and keeping them safe, though that was part of it. The Byzantine approach to inherited texts was active and engaged and argumentative. They wrote commentaries on commentaries. They compiled encyclopedias from older sources, selecting and organising material that might otherwise have been inaccessible. The Suda, the great 10th century Byzantine encyclopedic lexicon, drew on hundreds of earlier sources to create a reference work of extraordinary scope, preserving in its entries not just definitions but historical information, literary quotations, and biographical notices for thousands of figures, much of it derived from texts that no longer exist in any other form. The compilers of the Suda were doing the work of people who understood that the library they were drawing on might not always be available, and who were trying to make sure that when it became unavailable, as much of it as possible would survive in some usable form. This is not accidental foresight. It is the work of a civilization that had already seen what happened to libraries. Constantinople had endured fires, had endured periods of internal political crisis, violent enough to destroy significant portions of its accumulated culture. The instinct to copy, to compile, to make multiple records in multiple locations so that no single disaster could eliminate something irreplaceable, was an instinct born from experience rather than abstract prudence. The scriptorium you have been working in is one small part of this system, one of dozens operating simultaneously in the city alone. The monk in the cell next to the scriptorium who reads what the scribes produce and annotates his copy with marginal observations is also part of the system. The student who arrives from a distant province to study and copies texts to take back with him is also part of the system. The merchant who commissions a copy of a medical handbook for practical use, the wealthy collector who acquires an illuminated psalter for devotional use, the imperial librarian who maintains the palace collection, all of these are part of the same extended network of text production and preservation. The illuminated manuscripts deserve their own attention because they represent a category of object that is difficult to fully account for in purely functional terms. Most of what you've been copying in the scriptorium is plain text, letters on parchment without decorative elaboration, produced for use rather than display. But the tradition of Byzantine manuscript illumination produced objects of a different kind altogether, books whose pages contained miniature paintings executed with a precision and a sophistication of colour that represents one of the highest achievements of Byzantine visual culture. The relationship between text and image in these manuscripts is not simple. The images were not merely decorative, not simply visual equivalents of the text they accompanied. They participated in the interpretation of the text, making arguments through visual means that the text was making through verbal means, creating meanings through the juxtaposition of figure and word that neither alone could produce. A miniature of the Annunciation facing a page of gospel text was not simply an illustration, it was a theological statement, and the choices made about composition and colour and the placement of figures were choices made by people who understood both the visual and textual traditions they were working within and who could move between them deliberately. The gold backgrounds that are the most immediately recognisable feature of Byzantine sacred painting are worth a moment of specific attention. They are not decorative in the way that an elaborate border is decorative. They are a visual argument about the nature of the space depicted. Gold does not represent sky or interior architecture or any element of the physical world. It represents the absence of ordinary space, the indication that what is shown is not located in the world that the physical eye perceives, but in a realm that the image makes available precisely by refusing to depict the ordinary world around it. The flat frontal figures that occupy this space are not attempts to reproduce appearance. They are presentations of a reality that ordinary appearance cannot contain, and the formal conventions of the style are the means by which that presentation is made. This is a sophisticated argument, made in visual terms, about what images can do and what they cannot do, about the relationship between the visible and the invisible, about the specific capacity of a certain kind of formal art to indicate what naturalistic representation would obscure. You understand this more fully when you handle one of the illuminated manuscripts directly, holding it carefully in the lamplight and watching the gold of the background shift as you move the page, alive in a way that flat colour is not, present in a way that reproduction cannot fully convey. You set it down carefully and return it to its place and go back to your plain text and your pen, and you carry what you have just seen alongside the work for the rest of the afternoon, a second track of thought that the work has made possible. The city you're working in and the institution you're working within contain more than any single stay of any finite duration can exhaust. This is the quality that an accumulated civilization has, the quality of being always more than you expected and never quite as much as you might wish for. Each generation arrives at the accumulated past and finds more than it can take in completely and less than it might want, and the gap between those two measures is exactly what keeps the work going. You are part of this, in your small and specific and adequately spelled way. The chain continues through you, as it continued through the person who sat at this desk before you, and will continue through the person who sits at it after. Good enough, applied consistently and honestly across a long period of time, turns out to be exactly what the chain requires. There is one final thing to say about the life of the Byzantine scribe, something that is not about the work directly, but about the texture of the days that surrounded it. The monastery in which you have been working is not, from the outside, an interesting building. It is solid and functional, and built with the practical sensibility of people who expected it to stand for a long time and designed it accordingly. The exterior walls are stone, plain and thick, designed to manage heat and cold and the occasional vibration of earthquake rather than to impress. The gate is heavy. The courtyard inside is clean and functional, a working space rather than a decorative one, with the well at its centre and the garden plots along two walls, producing the vegetables that supplement the community's diet. But inside the walls there is a quality of life that is difficult to describe to someone who has not spent time inside a well-functioning religious community. A quality of collectedness that comes from people living in close proximity around a shared purpose over a long period of time. It is not silence exactly, because the monastery is not silent. There are bells and voices and the sounds of work and cooking and the practical life of any group of people sharing a space. But there is something underneath the sound that is different from the noise of the city outside, a quality of direction, of everything happening for a reason that is larger than the immediate task, of individual actions belonging to a whole that gives them meaning beyond their immediate function. You wake up at the bell and you attend prayer and you eat and you work and you eat again and you attend prayer again and you sleep, and then you do the same thing again, and the repetition does not accumulate as boredom, because each instance of it is slightly different from the one before it. The text is different. The quality of the light is different. Your own state of mind is different in ways that the stable structure of the day allows you to notice precisely because the structure itself is not changing. The variation that would be invisible inside a less structured life becomes legible inside a structured one. You learn, through the structure, something about your own patterns, about when you work best and when you do not, about what the hand and the mind need to operate together effectively and what they resist. This is not a small thing. Most people do not learn it. Most people live inside enough variation that the signal gets lost in the noise, that the patterns of their own functioning never become clear because the external conditions are always changing faster than the internal ones. The monastery strips away enough of that variation to let you see yourself working, and what you see is more interesting than you might have expected. You will take this knowledge with you when you leave, along with the manuscript and the callus that the pen has produced on your writing finger, and the particular quality of patience that develops when you have spent enough time doing careful work for its own sake. You will take the memory of the afternoon light when it comes right, and the sound of the bells at vespers coming in through the narrow window, and the specific quality of the old monk's attention when he works, which is not the same as the quality of concentration you have seen on other people's faces, but something deeper and quieter, more settled in itself, more complete. These are not things you could have planned to learn. They are things the work gave you, unexpectedly, in the spaces between the corrections and the aching hand and the dry bread and the inadequate light. That is how the best things tend to arrive. Outside the walls of Constantinople's monasteries, the official image was clear and consistent and carefully maintained. These were communities of prayer, of asceticism, of men who had renounced the world and its concerns in favour of a life devoted entirely to God. They fasted, they prayed at the appointed hours through the day and night, they worked with their hands in the kitchens and the gardens and the scriptoria, they operated hospitals for the poor and schools for those who came to study, and they performed a range of charitable functions that made them genuinely indispensable to the city's social infrastructure. The church endorsed. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The church endorsed them. The state funded them. The great aristocratic families gave them land and money in exchange for perpetual prayers on behalf of their ancestors' souls, and the exchange was considered worthwhile on both sides. It was a beautiful arrangement. It was also considerably more complicated than it appeared from any single direction. Byzantine monasticism had its roots in the radical experiments of the 4th century, when Christians in the Egyptian desert, in Syria, in Palestine, had developed forms of religious life that pushed the logic of renunciation to its outer edges. These earliest monks were not building institutions, they were fleeing them. They walked away from the church hierarchy and the Roman social order and the obligations and compromises of collective life to live in caves and hollow trees and makeshift shelters, seeking a direct relationship with God that the institutional church seemed, to them, to be complicating rather than facilitating. They wanted to be stripped of everything except what was essential, and they were prepared to experience considerable physical hardship in pursuit of that stripping. The movement they began had, by the 6th century and certainly by the 10th, become something that its founders would have found genuinely unrecognisable. Monasteries were large, they were wealthy, they had established relationships with imperial courts and aristocratic families and the great administrative structures of the church. They ran hospitals and schools and guest houses and agricultural estates and commercial workshops, producing goods for sale in the markets of the city. They were, in the most accurate and comprehensive sense of the word, institutions, with all that the word implies about the inevitable and permanent gap between founding ideals and operational reality. The wealth accumulated through multiple channels, and each channel created its own set of complications. Donations from wealthy families were the most significant source of monastic wealth, and they were made for a mixture of reasons that combined genuine piety with practical calculation in proportions that varied by family and by decade. A gift to a monastery purchased prayers, which were considered genuinely valuable investments in the spiritual economy that Byzantine Christianity took with complete seriousness. Prayers for the dead were not symbolic gestures in the Byzantine theological framework. They were real interventions in real spiritual processes, and the quality and consistency of the institution performing them mattered to the donors who paid for them. This is why wealthy families were often more interested in prestigious, well-run monasteries than in modest or poorly administered ones. The transaction required confidence in the counterparty. But gifts also served other purposes that were more calculating in character. Property placed in the hands of a monastery was removed from the category of personal wealth that could be taxed, confiscated, or redistributed by an emperor with political reasons to diminish a particular family's resources. Byzantine imperial history was full of episodes in which aristocratic fortunes were seized following the political disgrace of their owners, and the wealthy families of the empire had developed considerable sophistication about managing this risk. Monastic endowments were relatively protected from this kind of political redistribution in the Byzantine legal tradition, which made them attractive repositories for wealth in periods when political uncertainty was elevated. The monks who managed these endowments were therefore engaged in something considerably more complex than the maintenance of spiritual communities. They were managing portfolios in the most literal sense, administering income from agricultural estates and urban properties and commercial interests, negotiating with the families who had created those endowments and who maintained ongoing expectations about their management, and navigating the relationship between the institutional interests of the monastery and the personal interests of the individuals who had entrusted it with their family's property and their ancestors' spiritual welfare. The abbot stood at the centre of all of this. In theory, the abbot was selected through a process that prioritised spiritual fitness above all other qualifications. In practice, the selection was shaped by pressures that had little to do with spiritual fitness in any direct or simple sense. The founding family of the monastery, if it still existed and maintained engagement with the institution it had created, had views about who should lead it. These views were not expressed as demands exactly, but they were expressed, and they were expressed by people whose ongoing financial support was not incidental to the institution's continued functioning. The diocesan bishop had canonical authority over the appointment and his own relationships with different factions within the monastic community and with the families involved. If the monastery was large enough or prestigious enough, the imperial court itself might develop preferences, because an institution of significant spiritual prestige was also an institution of significant social and occasionally political influence. An abbot who successfully navigated all of these pressures over a long career was a person of considerable political sophistication, and political sophistication and spiritual depth are qualities that do not exclude one another, but do not naturally select for one another either. Some abbots were genuinely both, and they deserve to be taken seriously as such. Byzantine history produced real examples of men who combined authentic spiritual depth with the practical competence to manage a complex institution effectively, who could maintain the quality of common prayer and contemplative practice that the institution was designed to produce while simultaneously managing the administrative and financial and diplomatic requirements that its operation imposed. These were the figures whose holiness was acknowledged even by their opponents, whose counsel was sought by emperors, around whom hagiographies were written that have preserved their memory for 1,000 years. Others were primarily one thing, or primarily the other, and the institutions they led reflected that imbalance in ways that showed up in the documentary record over time. The monks themselves represented, across the full range of Byzantine monastic life, as wide a variety of reasons for being there as the institution could accommodate. Some had arrived with genuine and deep vocations, a pull toward the contemplative life that had been present from an early age, and that expressed itself in the monastery with the natural ease of something finding its correct environment. Others had been placed there, second sons of aristocratic families for whom the family's resources did not extend to establishing them comfortably in secular life. Young men who had made choices that were incompatible with continued ordinary life, and for whom the monastery represented a form of managed consequence. Men who had arrived with genuine spiritual intentions that had subsequently been complicated by the institutional reality they encountered when they got there, who had expected something and found something different, and who had learned to live in the gap. This range was not a failure of the system. It was the system as it actually operated in a real world. No institution that functions over centuries and accommodates large numbers of human beings is populated entirely by people who are perfectly suited to its stated purpose, and the Byzantine monastery was not an exception to this rule. What made the institution function was the quality of the structure that contained and directed all of these different people, the daily rhythm of prayer and work and common life that gave everyone something to do that was connected to the institution's purpose, regardless of how they had arrived or what they had been. But structure alone cannot resolve every tension. The specific tensions of Byzantine monastic life had a distinctive shape that shows up repeatedly in the historical record, and the patterns are recognizable enough to suggest that the institutional pressures that generated them were structural rather than incidental. The theological controversies that swept through Byzantine Christianity at regular intervals put the monasteries in positions that were genuinely impossible to navigate without cost. Iconoclasm, which unfolded in two phases across the 8th and 9th centuries, asked every monastery in the empire to choose between the emperor's policy of removing sacred images from churches and the traditional practices that most monastic communities had developed over generations and were deeply attached to. The monks who chose resistance most publicly paid very high prices for that choice. Theodora of Studios, the reforming abbot of the great Studios monastery in Constantinople, was exiled from the city multiple times for his consistent refusal to comply with iconoclast policy and his equally consistent denunciation of the ecclesiastical authorities who accommodated it. He maintained his theological position against imperial pressure with a stubbornness that was, depending on your perspective, either admirable integrity or political inconvenience elevated to a vocation, and probably both. But not every abbot had Theodore's resources, or his institutional position, or his particular combination of courage and strategic intelligence. Not every community had the strength to maintain open resistance over a prolonged period in the face of determined imperial pressure. The historical record of the iconoclast period, read carefully and with attention to the spaces between the explicit statements, shows communities making a wide range of accommodations, some principled, some pragmatic, some that resist clean categorization. The official history of iconoclasm, written in the subsequent decades by the people who had won, emphasized the heroic resistance and moved quickly past the less heroic moments. This is what official histories do. It does not mean the less heroic moments did not occur or that the people involved deserve condemnation. It means that the full picture is more complicated than the summary version suggests, and that people in genuinely difficult positions made genuinely difficult choices under real pressure. The property disputes that appear in Byzantine legal records involving monasteries have a specific quality that is worth examining carefully. They are not primarily about abstract questions of institutional governance or theological correctness. They are about land, about income from specific estates, about the ownership of particular buildings and workshops and fishing rights and urban properties. They involve monks taking each other to secular court, which the theoretical framework of monastic life strongly discouraged, and which the actual practice of monastic life apparently could not prevent when the stakes were high enough. They involve disputes between monasteries and the aristocratic families that had endowed them about the terms of endowments made 2 or 3 generations earlier, when the specific parties and specific circumstances were different from what they were now, but the obligations remained active. They involve accusations of financial mismanagement that have the texture of genuine concern rather than purely strategic litigation, mixed with accusations that have the texture of strategic litigation rather than genuine concern. These disputes are not mysterious. They are recognizable. They have the shape and the texture of institutional conflict that is not specific to monasteries, or to the Byzantine period, or to the particular religious framework within which they occurred. What makes them interesting is precisely the gap between the institutional framework, the official language of renunciation, and communal spiritual life, and the behavior it is supposed to contain. People who have renounced personal property in theory are disputing it in practice, and the dispute is real enough to have found its way into the secular courts. This gap is not primarily evidence of hypocrisy. It is evidence of the difficulty of maintaining the ideal under the pressure of operating a real institution in a real world where material decisions have real consequences. The people in these disputes were not, in most cases, simply ignoring what they had committed to. They were navigating the collision between what they had committed to and what the institution required of them, and the two were not always compatible. The hospitals that the larger Constantinople monasteries operated were real and should not be minimized or dismissed. The Xenon of the Pantocrator Monastery, established in the 12th century, represents one of the most sophisticated medical institutions in the medieval world by any standard that takes organizational intelligence seriously. It had separate wards for different categories of patient. It employed trained medical staff on regular contracts with specified duties. It had established procedures for admission and for the transition of patients between wards as their conditions evolved. It maintained pharmaceutical resources and a physical library. The level of organizational thought represented in the surviving foundation document is genuinely impressive and reflects sustained, serious attention to the problem of delivering care consistently to people who needed it and could not otherwise obtain it. The charter of the Pantocrator Xenon also reflects the specific complications of managing a charitable institution within a monastic context. The relationship between the medical functions and the spiritual functions of the institution, between the staff who worked in the hospital and the monks whose communal life was structured by entirely different requirements, between the obligations to the sick poor that the institution had undertaken and the obligations to its own community that took precedence when the two came into conflict. All of this required explicit negotiation and explicit resolution, and the Charter shows the marks of that negotiation in its specific provisions and in the specific problems it was apparently designed to prevent. What the Byzantine monastery actually was, over the long arc of its history in the city and the empire, was a human institution. It was built by human beings with human ideals, populated by human beings with human limitations, operating in a human world that did not arrange itself around its requirements. It produced genuine sanctity, and that sanctity was real and had consequences that reached far beyond the walls within which it was cultivated. It produced real scholarship, and the manuscripts copied in its scriptoria, and the commentary written in its libraries and the theological reflection conducted in its cells constitute a body of work that human beings are still reading and arguing about today. It produced real charity, and people who would otherwise have suffered without care were cared for, and that matters without qualification or caveat. The official story is not false. It is the story of the ideal that animated the institution, and that ideal was genuine and motivated real people to real effort and real sacrifice. The other story, the one you find when you look at the legal records and the hagiographies against the grain, and the accumulation of documentary evidence that fills in the spaces the official histories prefer to leave empty, is the story of the institution as it actually functioned. Both stories are true. The distance between them is not scandal. It is the ordinary, persistent, entirely human distance between what we intend and what we manage to do, between the institution we imagine building and the one we actually inhabit. There is one more dimension of Byzantine monastic life that deserves attention before we move on, and it is the one that is perhaps the most difficult to talk about clearly without losing either its genuine importance or its actual complexity. The monasteries were among the most significant sites of learning in the Byzantine world. The libraries attached to them preserved texts that would otherwise have been lost. The education provided in monastic schools trained the administrators and scholars and theologians who ran the empire's intellectual and administrative life across multiple generations. The commentary and interpretation produced by monastic scholars constitutes a body of thought that connects the ancient world to the medieval world in ways that shaped the subsequent history of European and Near Eastern culture in ways that are still traceable today. This was not incidental to the institutional purpose. It was the institutional purpose, or one of its central expressions. The preservation of knowledge was understood as a sacred obligation, and that understanding produced the institutional commitment that made the preservation happen. The connection between the sacred and the scholarly was not a piece of institutional rhetoric. It was a genuine and productive synthesis that worked because the people who maintained it believed in both parts of it simultaneously and did not experience them as competing. There were monasteries in Constantinople and the surrounding region that developed specializations. Some focused on medical knowledge, building the libraries and the practical expertise that their hospitals required. Others focused on theological scholarship, maintaining the collections and the scholarly culture that the ongoing theological debates of the Byzantine Church required. Others were primarily contemplative, less oriented toward scholarship and more toward the practice of prayer, and the cultivation of the interior life that the contemplative tradition had developed into a sophisticated set of techniques and disciplines over several centuries. The figure of the hesychast, the practitioner of the contemplative prayer practice known as hesychia, is one of the more interesting and more contested figures in Byzantine religious history. The hesychasts believed that through sustained contemplative practice, through the specific techniques of breath and attention, and the silent repetition of prayer that the tradition had developed, a person could achieve a state of awareness in which the uncreated light of God, the same light that had surrounded Christ at the Transfiguration on Mount Tabor, was directly and experientially perceptible. This was not a metaphor. It was a claim about what was actually available to human consciousness through specific practices diligently applied. The controversy this claim generated in the 14th century, when a monk named Barlaam of Calabria challenged the hesychasts on philosophical and theological grounds, and was challenged in turn by Gregory Palamas, is one of the most technically sophisticated theological disputes in the history of Christianity, engaging questions about the nature of God and the nature of human knowledge and the relationship between experience and doctrine that the tradition had been building toward for a very long time. Palamas won the debate in the institutional sense, his position was accepted and Barlaam's was condemned, and the hesychast tradition continued and spread. The questions the debate opened have not been closed. What matters for our purposes is not the technical theology but the institutional context. This dispute was conducted primarily by and within the monastic community. The great figures on both sides were monks. The institutions that supported each position were monasteries. The outcome of the debate was determined partly by theological argument and partly by the institutional politics of the monastic world. by which abbots had the relationships and the prestige to influence which side the key decision-makers took. The same dynamics that shaped the institution's management of property and personnel also shaped its engagement with its most abstract intellectual questions. This is not a criticism of the intellectual seriousness with which the questions were engaged. The seriousness was real. It is an observation about where serious intellectual work actually happens, which is inside institutions, and about the fact that institutions are always shaped by their own dynamics as much as by the explicit purposes they are organized around. The Hesychast debate was real theology conducted by real theologians with genuine stakes. It was also Byzantine monastic politics conducted by experienced institutional actors with genuine interests. These are not contradictory descriptions. The afterlife of Byzantine monasticism is itself a significant story. When Constantinople fell in 1453, the monasteries that survived became repositories for much of what had been in the city. Manuscripts were moved, sometimes desperately, sometimes strategically, sometimes both. Monks who had been in Constantinople ended up in Athos, in Crete, in Venice, in Rome, in any place that would receive them, and where their learning and their libraries might find a new context. The Greek scholars who moved to Italy in the decades before and after the fall carried with them the texts and the intellectual traditions that helped ignite the Renaissance, feeding a revival of classical learning in the West that had, at its root, the long and careful work of Byzantine scribes and Byzantine libraries over the preceding centuries. The monasteries of Mount Athos, the peninsula in northern Greece that had been a monastic centre since the 9th century, survived the fall of Constantinople and survive today. They still follow, in their broad outlines, the monastic rule that Byzantine abbots established 1,000 years ago. They still maintain libraries that contain manuscripts that scribes in Constantinople copied in rooms not very different from the one you have been spending your days in. They still ring bells in the dark for the night offices, and monks whose names you will never know get up in the cold and attend them, and return to their cells and sleep the few hours that remain before morning. The chain continues. It is a very long chain. There is one final observation to make about Byzantine monastic life before we leave it, an observation that connects the institution back to the city it existed within, to the empire it served, and to the specific character of the Byzantine relationship with time and continuity in the past. The monasteries were sites of this commitment in a specific and important way. The monks who maintained the liturgical calendar were maintaining a practice that had been continuous, in their understanding, since the founding of the Church. The scribes who copied the texts were preserving a connection to the civilization of classical antiquity that the Byzantine Church had not broken, that had been passed forward continuously, rather than rediscovered after a gap. The Hesychast monks who practiced their contemplative disciplines were employing techniques that had been developed and refined over centuries of practice in an unbroken tradition that connected them to the Desert Fathers and through them to the earlier centuries of Christian experience. This is not simply ideology. The texts that Byzantine monks copied and that Byzantine scholars commented on did in fact preserve the intellectual heritage of the ancient world in forms that would not otherwise have survived the political convulsions of the subsequent centuries. When the humanist scholars of the Italian Renaissance encountered Byzantine manuscripts and Byzantine scholars in the 14th and 15th centuries, they found not just old texts, but a living tradition of engagement with those texts, a tradition of commentary and interpretation and scholarly practice that had maintained its connection to the sources across a millennium. The revival of classical learning in the West that we call the Renaissance was not a recovery from the ground. It was a transfer from a living tradition that had never stopped. The monk in the cold cell at 3 a.m, getting up for the night office, following the rule that his abbot followed and his abbot's abbot followed before him, in a chain that extended back through time to the founders of the tradition, was doing something that would have seemed to himself entirely ordinary. He was doing what monks did. He was maintaining what monks maintained. He was his small part of a very large structure, adding his individual life to the accumulated life of the institution, which was adding its accumulated life to the accumulated life of the civilization. That is not nothing. It is, in its quiet and unremarkable way, one of the more significant things that human beings have found ways to do. Tonight we travelled across a great deal of the Byzantine world, moving from the immediate physical reality of the street level to the heights of imperial power and back down again to the quiet work of a desk in a cold room, and then through the walls into the complicated interior of an institution that presented a perfect face to the world and contained, as all institutions do, something considerably more mixed behind it. We spent a long day in a city that was too dense and too alive and too full of its own continuous logic to be comprehended quickly or easily. A city that absorbed you into its noise and its commerce and its social networks and its navigational puzzles without pausing to orient you first. We followed a woman whose story is usually reduced to its most dramatic moment, the speech before the riot, when the more interesting story is the whole arc, the decades of careful observation and accumulation, and the very specific quality of clarity that arrived when it was needed most. We watched the slow, meditative work of copying texts that had already survived longer than any individual would survive, adding one more link to a chain of attention that had been running since before the empire was born and would continue running after it ended. And we looked with clear eyes at what the monastery was and what it was not, finding what is always there when you look at human institutions honestly, the mixture of aspiration and reality, of genuine commitment and genuine failure, of people doing their best inside conditions that did not always make their best sufficient. The thread connecting all of this is simple and old. People in every... If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. People in every era, in every role, in every institution have been doing the same essential work of trying to live meaningfully inside conditions that were not designed with their comfort or their dignity as primary considerations. Constantinople was built for empire, not for the individual navigating it on foot with cold hands and no connections. The imperial court was built for political power, not for a bearkeeper's daughter from the wrong side of the hippodrome. The scriptorium was built for the preservation of texts, not for the comfort of the hands preserving them. The monastery was built for God, or for the idea of God, and it turned out to contain human beings instead, who brought with them everything they were. And yet people found their way through it. They learned the streets, they made the copy, they rang the bells in the dark, they held the room when everyone else was calculating their exit. The chain continued. It always continued. There is a quality to that continuity that is worth sitting with for a moment before sleep, not as a grand statement about the resilience of the human spirit, because that kind of language makes things too large and too smooth, but as a simple, specific observation about something ordinary and durable. People kept going, not because the circumstances were favourable, not because the systems were designed with them in mind, not because history was moving in their direction. They kept going because stopping was worse, and because there were things that needed doing, and because sometimes, in the middle of difficult work in difficult conditions, something happens in the body and the mind together that makes the difficulty temporarily irrelevant and allows the next thing to get done. The Byzantines understood themselves as inheritors and stewards, people who had been given something by the past and were obligated to pass it forward, not unchanged, not without their own additions and corrections and complications and failures, but forward, readable, available to whoever came next. That is what the copying was. That is what the walls were. That is what the long, slow work of daily life in a city that demanded everything was, repeated across generations until the demands changed, and the city changed, and the empire eventually ended in a way it had always known, abstractly, that it would. The empire ended. The knowledge continued. The walls are mostly gone now, but what moved through them is still moving. The texts are in libraries from Istanbul to Oxford to Vatican City, some of them still bearing the tiny marks that supervisors like your supervisor left in the margins, the small evidence of a person who thought the spacing mattered and said so clearly. The mosaic at Ravenna still holds Theodora's gaze. The questions that the monastery was built to ask are still being asked in other buildings by other people. History does not end cleanly. It continues in the form of things that were carried forward by people who kept going when the circumstances gave them no particular reason to, and it continues in the form of questions that do not have final answers and are worth asking anyway, and it continues in the form of a quiet recognition, at the end of a long evening of attention, that the people in these stories were doing something recognisably similar to what you are doing right now, trying to rest in the middle of a complicated world, trying to hold on to what matters while letting go of what cannot be helped. The city outside is settling into its later hours. The bells are marking the time in the old way, the way they have marked it for a very long time, and the time they are marking is continuous with the time that was being marked when the empire was new and the walls were just being built and no one yet knew how long any of it would last. You're inside that continuity tonight. You're resting inside a very long story, and the story does not require you to be awake for it to continue. Let Constantinople go about its business. Let Theodora hold the room. Let the scribe finish the line and set down the pen. Let the bells ring in the monastery courtyard without your attendance. The night is quiet and the journey is done, and the only thing remaining is the particular rest that settles in after a long day's travel has finally arrived where it was always going. You're allowed to rest now. Good night. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.